on, come on, come on, come on, now touch me, babe. Can't you see that I am not afraid? What was that promise that you made? Why won't you tell me what she said? What was that promise that you made? Now I'm gonna love you till the heavens stop the rain. I'm gonna love you till the stars fall from the sky.
The Doors were the other side of the American dream. They were the band who made it by breaking the rules.
I think the Doors were one of the most groundbreaking, imaginative, important bands of the 1960s and 70s. And in Jim Morrison, the Lizard King, they have one of the most iconic frontmen of all time.
The Doors were a great rock group with mystical pretensions. Jim Morrison was born in Melbourne, Florida in 1943 to Clara and Admiral George Morrison, who was very high up in the Navy.
Jim Morrison talks about this formative experience that he had as a child when he saw a car accident on a Native American reserve.
Jim talked about blood and guts on the highway, very much implying that he'd seen dead people on the road. His family completely disputed that. They said there had been a crash and there was a very small Native American boy who was quite upset, far from being ill. There were no guts and blood on the road, but this was, I think, the first real example of Jim's myth-making.
Jim Morrison was a military brat. His dad was in the forces, so they moved around a lot when he was young. And I think this probably had a knock-on effect on his personality and his character.
Jim was a very polite child, and he was always a charmer. But there was also another side to him, a much more devilish side. And he'd play nasty games with his brother. He'd tape his mouth up while he slept. He used language which was particularly unsuitable for his age and for the era. So the rebel persona was already developing.
As a young man, Jim read voraciously, particularly poetry and philosophy, so the writers of the French Enlightenment.
Jim Morrison was very influenced by Baudelaire, by Rimbaud, by John Cocteau, and also by the Beats, Allen Ginsberg, Gregory Corso, Jack Kerouac. So on one side, you had this very classical beginnings of French 19th century symbolism, and then you have the very American, freedom-loving 1940s, 1950s poets, and somehow they all soaked in, and Jim Morrison used it all.
Ray Manzarek was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, which is a pretty tough environment.
Manzarek's education was more stable and certainly more musically based. He was learning piano from the age of 8 onwards. Apparently very good at basketball and was almost a professional basketball player, but at 16 gave it up after having one argument too many about what position he should play.
Jim and Ray first met at UCLA, where they both studied film. After finishing the course, they bumped into each other at Venice Beach.
Ray Manzarek asked Jim Morrison what he'd been doing, and Jim Morrison showed him the lyrics to a poem that he'd written that would become Moonlight Drive. Ray Manzarek was absolutely bowled over by this, and he knew that immediately he'd found the man who would make his musical dreams flesh.
Time to live, time to lie.
Initially, Jim Morrison was making music with Ray Manzarek with Rick and the Ravens, which also included two of Ray's brothers, but then they left and Robbie Krieger and John Densmore were brought in on guitar and drums, and that then was the first proper formation of the Doors.
Jim Morrison coined the name The Doors, and this was from Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception. But it was also, in turn, taken from William Blake's notion, but between the things known and the things unknown are the Doors. So it was a double whammy from Jim Morrison.
In 1966, the Doors became the house band at the LA club London Fog. The club wasn't exactly jam-packed every night, so they used their opportunity to really hone their songs and develop their craft.
Eventually, people started going to see the Doors, and they moved a few doors up the road to the Whiskey A Go-Go, where they became a massive LA cult.
They had a session there and they had a support slot with Van Morrison's Them. Jim Morrison would watch Van Morrison's stage antics, which were not typical. Rather than try and ingratiate himself with the audience, he did the opposite. He tried to antagonise the audience.
I think there was probably quite a lot of influence on Jim Morrison's kind of stage presence and this performing style from Van Morrison. In fact, they seemed to form quite a good bond. They joined them on stage quite a lot to jam Here Comes the Night and songs like Gloria.
One of the people who saw the Doors while they were doing their residency at the Whiskey A Go-Go was Jack Holzman, the founder of the Elektra label. The first night he wasn't overly convinced. The second night he was quite convinced. And on the third night he saw them, he offered them a contract.
The Doors' self-titled debut album came out in 1967. Although not a massive success at that time, actually is now hailed as one of the key moments in the progression of psychedelic rock, and it's being compared to artists like Brian Wilson in terms of really pushing the boundaries of what music was like at that time.
What I think is special about the Doors is that they're a 60s band, but they're not a typical 60s band. They don't sound purely 60s. One of the reasons for that, just on a technical level, is that Ray Manzarek is leading it, and he's playing all the melody on the keyboard, on the Hammond organ, but the bass is actually the pedals. So that gives a very, very different sound.
Can you still recall the time we cried? Break on through to the other side. Break on through to the other side.
Break On Through is a great song, wasn't a big hit, and then came Light My Fire. It was originally a 7-minute song. It was the producer, Paul Rothchild, who cut it down to 3 minutes, just compressing it into a fantastic pop song.
You know that it would be untrue. You know that I would be a liar if I was to say to you, girl, we couldn't get much higher.
And it had completely the desired effect. It absolutely nailed it then on radio and became their first hit, and in fact the first #1 for Elektra Records.
In September 1967, the Doors made their debut on The Ed Sullivan Show. They were asked by the show's producer in Light My Fire to replace the word higher with the word better.
When it came to the actual recording of this, whether by accident or by design, Jim Morrison sang higher.
At which point the producers told them they'd never appear on the show again. Ed Sullivan cancelled another 6 appearances which they were due to make. When this was put to Jim Morrison, he didn't seem to mind because he said, hey, we've already done the Ed Sullivan Show.
They're dealing with subjects that hadn't really been touched on before. You know, a kind of slightly darker attitude to sex. And then at the same time you had Alabama Song, which is an old Kurt Weill song. You know, Take Me to the Next Whiskey Bar. And this was out of step with the times.
Well, show me the way to the next whiskey bar.
Oh, don't ask why. Oh, don't ask why.
The album itself ended up selling over 20 million copies across its entire run, which is a huge amount.
The Doors' second album, Strange Days, came out just 8 months after their debut and saw the band experimenting with new sounds.
Let's swim out tonight, love. It's our time to try. Park beside the ocean on our moonlight drive.
The Doors' second album, Strange Days, I think marks the moment when we first hear that classic Moog synthesizer on the Doors records.
The second Doors album went platinum in the United States and reached #3. It was mostly comprised of songs that they'd been playing during their Whiskey A Go-Go residency, but there were completely new songs too, not least People Are Strange, which was one of the first mysterious, unusual, otherworldly Doors songs.
You're strange. Faces come out of the rain. When you're strange, no one remembers your name. When you're strange, when you're strange, when you're strange.
It caught a very, very different mood. The Doors, the first album, even though you have the end, It's quite innocent, really. It's quite energetic and upbeat and hopeful and curious. And then you've got this album which is Paranoid. So I think that it was actually a very prescient album, and it caught a sort of underlying tension which was just emerging.
In 1967, the Doors were playing in New Haven, and there is the now infamous story of Jim Morrison being arrested on stage mid-gig.
Shortly before the Doors went on stage in New Haven, Connecticut in 1967, Jim Morrison was entertaining a female fan when a policeman burst in. Jim Morrison was quite abusive towards him, and the policeman maced him. Later that night, when the Doors went on stage, Jim Morrison explained what had happened to the audience at great length, using incredibly foul language. And there was a heavy police presence, and Jim Morrison was arrested on stage and charged with lewd behaviour and inciting a riot. The charges were very, very soon dropped, but it really enhanced his counterculture status. So the Doors were not just the band, they were having hits such as Light My Fire. They had a dangerous man fronting them.
Love me two-time girl, one for tomorrow, one kiss for today. Love me two-time, I'm gone away. Hello, I love you, won't you tell me your name? Hello, I love you, let me jump in your game. Hello.
The Doors' third album, Waiting for the Sun, is their first #1 album, and of course marks that turning point of them becoming a huge band commercially and critically.
The recording sessions were very, very difficult because Jim was becoming unpredictable. He was drinking heavily, he was taking a lot of drugs, and he was starting, I think, to believe a lot of his own publicity.
Paul Rothchild was getting very frustrated because Jim Morrison was drinking very, very heavily, and he had all these hangers-on who were coming to the studio the whole time. Well, no producer wants that when he's trying to coax a band to make an album.
Jim said he wanted to leave the band, but Ray persuaded him to give it 6 months more. The Doors soon set out on a tour of America and Europe.
There was a concert in Amsterdam where the Doors were billed to play with Jefferson Airplane, and the rest of the Doors were rather dismayed to look out onto the stage and see Jim Morrison playing with Jefferson Airplane. He'd got on stage with them and was drunkenly crashing about until he actually collapsed. The Doors were forced to go on without him. When it gets to this stage, he's not really a functioning lead singer.
The Soft Parade was the fourth album, came out in 1969 and was again hugely commercially successful.
Wild child, full of grace, savior of the human race.
Because of how Jim was behaving, the Soft Parade was delayed even more than Waiting for the Sun had been. And in the end, it cost $80,000 to make.
It took them 9 months to make, which is so much longer than their other albums. And it's also the moment I think the critics turned on them. And interestingly, it's the first album where each of the members of the band are credited for writing, whereas previously all songs were credited to the Doors. And this is, I think, due to Jim Morrison not necessarily wanting to be associated with some of the music that his band members were writing.
Come on, come on, come on, come on, now touch me, babe. Can't you see that I am not afraid? What was that promise that you made?
The Soft Parade critically didn't do so well, but it succeeded commercially. And the Doors were just huge by this point. But Jim Morrison didn't really want to be there.
Now I'm gonna love you till the heavens stop the rain. I'm gonna love you till the stars fall from the sky. For you and I,
The Doors' notorious gig at the Coconut Grove in Miami was something of the Doors' legend, a show that was oversold, it was very full, it was very hot, and Jim Morrison was quite intoxicated, as usual, around this point in his career. He was taking on this idea of being very confrontational with the crowd, swearing at them, shouting at them, and at one point someone chucked a drink over him, so he started to take his clothes off, and then the crowd followed suit.
And then, allegedly, according to the police, he exposed himself on stage. The rest of the Doors say it never happened, but he was certainly drunk and abusive.
He was arrested and charged with indecent exposure and actually found guilty and sentenced to 6 months in jail and hard labour, although he was allowed to stay free pending an appeal.
The effect that it had on the Doors' career was catastrophic. They were blacklisted by radio. They had to abandon the huge tour that they were on. And from that point, promoters were wary of booking them for shows because of the baggage that came with a Doors concert.
In 1970, they released Morrison Hotel, which is widely lauded as one of their best albums. It had a consistent hard rock sound, which really was a return to form for them.
Morrison Hotel is a band playing live again. They just kind of got their groove back.
I'll keep your eyes on the road, you hands upon the wheel.
Jim Morrison re-entered the band as a songwriter. He's much more engaged in what they're doing, and creatively he's at a really good point. And I think there has been some kind of resolution at this point between him and his bandmates.
They sounded much more unified. It was much less pretentious than they had been, and it was more bluesy. The songs were shorter and the songs were stronger too.
Let it roll, baby, roll. Let it roll, all night long.
The Doors did get some concerts. They weren't completely blacklisted by the live circuit, but when they played the Warehouse in New Orleans, it all came to an end.
Jim Morrison had what's been described as a breakdown on stage midway through the set. He started banging his microphone on the stage floor until he'd created actually a hole in the floor, and then just sat there and refused to perform anymore. And it was after that performance that the rest of the band got together and decided it just wasn't sensible and it wasn't healthy for Jim Morrison to perform live anymore.
The band didn't split up, but that was the end of the Doors as a live band.
LA Woman was the Doors' final studio album, and actually, again, is considered a classic album.
It was conceived differently to the other albums, partially because Paul Rothchild, their very, very dictatorial, straight producer, left halfway through, and the recording sessions were much more fun.
It's got some brilliant songs on it. Riders on the Storm, of course, LA Woman as well. I think it's just a really fitting final album from the Doors. It really reminds you what a great band they were.
It's kind of continuing where Morrison Hotel left off, in the sense that it's getting much more into the blues.
City at night, city at night, city at night, city at night.
It's got that menace, and that's what I think the Doors did so well. At their best, there's a sort of novelistic approach. You know, it's really a short story, Riders on the Storm.
Riders on the storm. There's a killer on the road. His brain is squirming like a toad. Take a long holiday. Let your children play.
Following the release of LA Woman, Jim Morrison decided he needed a break after releasing 6 albums in just 4 years. He decided to move to Paris with his longtime girlfriend, Pamela Courson.
I think actually Paris was good for him. Obviously not in the end, but in the short term he straightened out. He wasn't drinking, wasn't taking drugs, lost weight because he'd been putting on loads of weight. He was walking a lot and he was writing.
On July 3rd, 1971, Jim Morrison was found dead by Pamela Courson in the bathtub of the Paris apartment that they shared.
She was the only witness to his death. There was no autopsy, although there should have been, because Jim was dying when he was only 27. Nobody saw the body, which would later give rise to unfounded speculation that he hadn't really died. And he allegedly died in the bathtub of heart failure.
Jim Morrison's buried at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. It's become one of the most visited graves in that cemetery. Thousands of fans of The Doors go and pay their respects there every year.
The legacy of The Doors is a band who put poetry into rock, and they've influenced a whole generation of bands who've tried to do the same, but they've never quite captured the magic that The Doors had.
You know that it would be untrue. You know that I would be a liar if I was to say to you, girl, we couldn't get much higher. Come on, baby, light my fire.
The Doors' legacy is a permanent imprint on the history of rock and roll, and Jim Morrison was quite simply one of the most iconic frontmen of all time.
The time to hesitate is through. No time to wallow in the mire.
He became this symbol, very attractive symbol of rebellion. You know, very, very good looking, really good voice. And the Doors songs at their best are just fantastic.
Come on, baby, light my fire. Come on, baby, light my fire. Try to set the night